I know the schedule. So it seems I picked a bad day between Thanksgiving and Christmas.
No, not necessarily. It's usually all over the board tab and
No.
Karen, do you need us to send you the embed?
So I take the 2 Tylenol now, right?
I'm gonna log in.
There's a little automatic.
Yes.
We need to do it.
The slideshow.
Yeah.
What should I start now?
Not yet, because I need to log in.
Oh.
But do you want to do your own today? Okay, then why don't you go get your laptop? And let's like, you know.
You did. Been fine, what am I doing? Good. What's in this next one? No, I'm sorry. I'm doing. Oh, too. We're talking about it. We made a lot of. Good. Yeah, we made a lot of ones too. That's our part. What is another program? Oh, good, considering. Yeah. Oh, God, don't know, I'm so happy. When did you go in? You came right, right?
Yeah, it was last time.
Yeah.
10 days and then a couple of things getting them. He just started to sit up over and walking.
Oh, God, no.
So they had last. He's not done. They look from the grocery.
I know.
Oh, my God.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, well. I
The whole thing, turkey, fries, the whole thing. Oh, nice. I don't want turkey on it. And put in.
Yes.
Some get a homemade, so that I remove the bone, the here, keep the root. But I've got some. I don't, you know, yeah, right now. There's a rinse for my mouth.
Yeah, no, I'm.
I have to go back next week. It's gonna be the one for giving. These plans every 3 months, because I have gingivitis and I'm. But it doesn't.
Read the big one.
This is room 103.
This is 103?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
You know what? And I. I want to that's problem like I sort of I guess, but I'm like I mean, we don't have a lot of speed.
But,
Because the rain is much.
you're gonna make it through this stuff by a little bit.
Okay.
And, we have,
Yeah. Jones. Yes. People don't like to like. We can
I work with the RTC, my husband is at the press with our RTC, so. Okay, awesome, yeah, so we both did, I did 9 months. Did you get it open up? Okay, I think that's where you came from. So my husband is a CEO. Yeah, so we looked at it. Yeah, it's mine.
What's the advantage of wines?
Did you get to get?
So we were.
Our liquor is dead.
This one, you can hospital there and then you can follow up too. Yeah. I did there first.
It's,
Should I be there? Where, like, you guys are handling that's the fingers crossed.
And here, the area, James.
I mean, it's nice to have more. So like, that's like, that's kind of pretty much, there's, I mean, it's like you need stuff in one stage versus like. Where's whether not. Well, we were there during COVID time, so like, finished, like, most of mainland was like travel. But it was still in the, yeah, there's so crazy. I went to well, so that was nice. So I was like, hey, there. So we got there right in February 2020, and then 2023.
Yeah. Right. Just for music, left it. So my husband got
Yeah. We have summer 26. Trying to extend another year to get our oldest is in middle school, so I don't get her through 8th grade. We could get the secret of going to the high stage after this.
I think I should share the meeting with the committee of some. Republicans went to.
So that's happened to our. And then the person my husband replaced, well, the person for that.
Asking for ideas. I really, I mean, it's just there. For your medals. You guys find like your help. She was a coach.
I was like, I mean, our kids, if we could, we had 4 years, well, he could retire. And it's like, they'll let us stay here in the village. Like our kids, like love the neighborhood, love the school.
Well, there were some interesting things that came.
But June is probably most likely where we could go after this, and like our hope is at that point, we can stay 8 years there, that would get our.
The way the MPs are dealing with things, some are predictable, some are predictable. I also expected that MPs would work better with mayors and district executives within the share. Because the executives are appointed by the president. And so, it's gonna be
Decided.
But then, right, because I came up with sometimes the mayor and the executive from one party could work with the second country. If they have aspirations of contesting the seats in the county elections, they might actually not be. That's right. Thank you.
I was sorry. Yeah.
Right about it. Also turns out.
Carol.
For me to be. How long you've been a report today is the committee on parliament. They were could use to regulate. So if you were coming to for application for some consult before you sign up, you know, from the.
Either way,
Like I get feel that we just. You'll use that to
Right.
That is the way in which they get resources. I'm trying to understand how, when there was something politics in. It seems to be yes, sounds of there's one who's.
Yeah, so.
Who has a PhD in economics, was assigned for committee of.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce our old friend Marianne Kneuer, who is a professor of party politics at the Dresden University of Technology and director of the Institute for Political Science there. Marianne is a visiting fellow at the Institute, as you know, and she has done very important contributions to the study of democracy, including the study of what she called authoritarian gravity centers, centers that influence the autocratization of particular regions, the study and conceptualization of democratic backsliding, a central topic for our days, and perhaps more innovatively now, the development of the conceptualization of what to do after democratic backsliding. That is the problem of democratic reconstruction, which is one of the central emerging themes in the study of democratic backsliding nowadays, including a series of discussions about what constitutional scholars have called, for instance, constitutional repair. So it is, please help me in welcoming Marianne Kneuer today.
Thank you so much, Anibal, for your nice introduction. Thank you for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to be here in Kellogg, first of all, and then also now being able to present the fruit of the work I've been doing here so far. And of course, I will continue. So yeah, we are talking about democratic backsliding, or how I prefer to label it, democratic erosion. And my project here, as Anibal already emphasized, addresses a topic that actually points to a new puzzle, although related, of course, to democratic erosion or backsliding, but it's a new puzzle that we are confronted here with. You hear me? Everybody's hearing me well? So my voice is good, or should I speak up, or everything's fine? Okay, you tell me when I need to change anything, okay? So the new puzzle I want to discuss with you is what happens after a process of democratic erosion has been brought to an end. We all know that democratic erosion can stop. There is enough empirical evidence for that. I mean, United States in 2020, Brazil in 2022, Poland last year in 2023. But we know little to nothing about the episode that then evolves after democratic erosion has stopped. And after erosion agents, that's the way I call it, the actors responsible for erosion agents, have been replaced. My aim, therefore, is to draw attention to what I call the post-erosion episode, and to draw the attention to the fact that there are several paths and several possible outcomes that are theoretically possible and empirically observable. And what I present today is mainly a basic framework of post-erosion trajectories and some basic thoughts on the factors that account or might account for success or failure of democratic reconstruction in this post-erosion episode. So I think looking at you, I actually do not have to define democratic erosion. It's here in my text, but I skipped this because I think you're all experts of this in this field, so I can leave this aside and come to the question, why is it important to talk about post-erosion episodes? Firstly, there is quite some confusion in terminology and also in concepts, because many terms are buzzing around right now in the field, like resilience, recovery, resistance, U-turns, bouncing back, and they all lack, in my opinion, sound delineation and conceptualization. Resilience is not the same as resistance, and terms like bouncing back or U-turns used in the We Dem Democracy report are misleading, as they insinuate a simple and automatic dynamic, like you throw a ball against the wall and it bounces back automatically. But this is not the case. So I call for a sound conceptualization, and I try to make an offer for that. Secondly, I attach great scholarly but also practical political importance for future work on the post-erosion developments, because democratic erosion is, as we know, the main route of democratic regression. It's 70% of all the cases that decline via democratic erosion. And it's highly likely that it will remain the defining feature of global politics in the future. So I think one of the most pressing questions also for practitioners domestically and internationally is, how can the return to democracy be supported at home, but also from outside? And in order to give meaningful answers and advice, democracy scholars firstly need to know and understand better this post-erosion episode. So what I present today is a conceptual approach, again, how to tackle this post-erosion episode. And I start with some theoretical premises. Namely, first of all, and this underlines, my foundation. Stopping democratic erosion is not reversing it. This is not a banal statement because, again, a lot of scholars do conflate the stopping of erosion and the reversal of erosion. So I state and I hold that the end of an episode of democratic erosion is not equivalent to a full restoration of democracy, of a functioning liberal democracy, and it's not equivalent to the restoration of the status quo ante in the country. Second, the end of democratic erosion here, I hope you can see that. Yeah, okay, so the end of the democratic erosion then constitutes the starting point, and this is important, the starting point for a new episode, which I then call the post-erosion episode. And this post-erosion episode, I conceive as an open-ended episode, which offers a diversity of outcomes and, again, trajectories. So one of them can be recovery and democratic reconstruction, but we should be cautious with any deterministic assumptions about the outcome. Fourth, it is reasonable to consider that this phase here, this episode of post-erosion, is closely linked to what happens during the other episode of erosion. I mean, we can certainly consider and think about influences from the democratic erosion that then manifest during the post-erosion episode. So there is a close linkage. But, and this is my most important point, we need also to conceive these two processes of erosion and then post-erosion as two distinct processes that have different determinants and different logics of action. And this is exactly what has been conflated so far. And only if we conceive these three, parts of the overall dynamics as distinct, we can get a better understanding of what is happening in each of them. So what I'm going to do today is firstly defining what is the stopping of democratic erosion. This is also something which has not been done systematically. Second, I then present my framework for the post-erosion trajectories. And finally, I will dwell on some factors of successful or not democratic reconstruction. What I cannot present today, and I'm very sorry for that, and I beg your patience for next year maybe, is the measurement of post-erosion episodes. So I certainly am planning and already doing this measurement, which is also something which has not been done so far. And I finished operationalization, so therefore I can answer any question you might have in the Q&A, but I don't want to dwell so much on these things here because it would eat a lot of time. And therefore I leave it maybe to your questions. The most important thing, although, is that I use the Liberal Democracy Index by VDEM. This is one important aspect, and that I base several aspects of my operationalization on the episodes of regime transformation by Serafine Merz et al. And on the most recent approach by Riedel, Friesen, McCoy, and Roberts. So the first thing I want to clarify now is the stopping of democratic erosion. And again, we don't have any systematization so far. What I do here is looking at empirical evidence. And this means that, I will present 4 modes of stopping democratic erosion, but of course it is possible that there are others out there and will come. And then the nice thing is you can simply expand my systematization and my suggestion for capturing these modes of ending democratic erosion. So starting one of the most popular or most common forms of ending democratic erosion is popular vote. So in presidential systems, this is quite easy and clear, so to say, because you simply vote out the incumbent and then you vote for the alternative candidate, like it happened in 2022 with Joe Biden. And then the erosion agent is voted out. However, this is not so easy in parliamentarian systems. So therefore, I actually make a difference between popular vote, which would be directly vote out the erosion agents, like in the case of Donald Trump, but which does not materialize in the same way in parliamentarian systems, where in a lot of cases, like if you look at Czech Republic or Poland now in autumn last year, actually the erosion agents keep their majority of votes and seats. So we might not forget that in Poland, the PiS repeated their victory for the third time. You know, it's only the fact that the forming of a coalition could then make possible and enable an alternative to the erosion agents. So for parliamentarian systems, the most probable option for ending a democratic erosion is forming an alternative government on the basis of a coalition against the majority of the erosion agents party. Again, this is the case of Czech Republic or of Poland last year. But the takeaway is that these most common forms of ending democratic erosion are modes where erosion agents are removed in fair and free elections by gaining majorities or by voting out a president in the respective system. So less common forms of stopping democratic erosion is popular unrest or protest. This can play an influential role and of course also influence then elections. So mostly popular protest comes together or goes along in the context then with elections, like for example in Bulgaria or also in Bolivia 2019. Bolivia also is a good example for the overlap of different dynamics that then also take place. But again, popular protest can be a trigger and also a catalyzing moment for the end of democratic erosion. And then fourth, very rare mode, but still it's interesting and therefore I want to present it. And still it's also possible for other cases. It's an inner party change. So that means that there's a shift of direction by the government of the same party, but a different leader. So we have a change in leadership, the same party, and then therefore also a change in the political course, like in Ecuador in 2017. Here, the long-serving erosion agent Rafael Correa did not choose an unconstitutional manner of staying in power as did Morales in Bolivia, but he chose a different way, namely appointing, so to say, his close buddy and former vice president as candidate for presidency, Lenin Moreno, assuming that Lenin Moreno would follow his path. And then interestingly, and for Correa, surprisingly, he did not. So inner party change would be a rare but still existing way of stopping democratic erosion. So if you ask now, how do I measure the stopping of democratic erosion? I can answer this again later on if you want. But now I would come actually to my framework of post-erosion trajectories and outcomes. So here you also see how, oh, you cannot see it here. It's a little bit covered, but here would be the explanation for the measurement of democratic stopping of democratic erosion. So what you here see is in the middle are my trajectories, and then at the right from your side No fire alarm, please. I have had a couple here in Notre Dame, and I'm quite afraid of these fire alarms. So to the right, you can see then the outcomes. So of course, starting with the most desirable trajectory, which would be the full democratic reconstruction after the stopping of democratic erosion, that can have, I mean, there's a variation of possible ways or possible outcomes. The first one would be that we have really practically at the highest point of, improvement after the democratic erosion stopped. This would level, so to say, the level of democratic quality that the country had before erosion began. So really that would mean that the country really achieves to restore the quality of democracy that had been there before. But the other way is, and that's also, I give you now in the next slide, you will get the illustration for that. But the other possibility is that the democratic level even would exceed the previous level that the country had before eroding. So this is also possible. So there can be also an improvement that exceeds the level of democraticness that had been existing in the country before erosion. But then also, and here we are already in kind of a difficult measurement problem also. What about those countries who would not completely restore or reconstruct democracy in the way that, they would reach the same level of democraticness? This is can also be possible, So for this case, I will introduce a new measurement, an innovative element of measuring, and that would be below the full reconstruction of democracy, which would be, if you want, so 100%, I would suggest to measure different degrees of improvement below this complete reconstruction. So I will measure minimal, medium, and also strong improvement of democratic quality, but which would not achieve this full 100% reconstruction of the democraticness, of the previous democraticness. So then, considering other trajectories, and this is my main argument that there are other trajectories, we can look at what I call stalemate situation or stasis. What does this mean? This means that democratic forces and veto players in a country after stopping the democratic erosion are wrestling with each other, which leads then to a stagnation of democratic recovery and to a frozen situation, which means that there is neither improvement nor decline, nor further decline. So we would have a situation of stasis and no indication what direction the country in terms of democraticness would take. And interestingly, we can, you will see, I uncovered the surprise on the next slide. And then the last, and of course, worst scenario would be the trajectory of renewed episode of erosion. This can happen in a country while being in recovery. So while being in a stalemate situation, for example, in this frozen situation, but also in a situation of democratic improvement. And this means that the country then experiences a renewed episode of erosion. This renewed episode can be triggered by the same erosion agents. This would be the case like in the United States. So you have Donald Trump, who was responsible for the democratic erosion between 2016 and 20. And now as he has been re-elected, he can become a new driver for another episode of backsliding. And I would actually think that this is going to be the case. So I expect another episode of democratic erosion. And then this would be the same erosion agent that comes here, or that who will be responsible for that. But it also can be other erosion agents. It can be other persons, it can be other parties that then are responsible for this renewed episode of backsliding. Interestingly, and against my own intuition, this trajectory is more common than I thought. So there are a couple of countries I found who had this trajectory, like Benin and a lot of Eastern European and also, Eastern European post-socialist countries. So now we have, I will present my examples. So we have on the side of the full restoration here, Czechia. You can see very well that after this very short and very swift improvement from 21 to 23, the level of democraticness is exactly the same as in 2012 when erosion started. So this is an example for this very nice reconstruction of democracy in Czech Republic. In Ecuador, also, we have leveling the same, the same democraticness as before in 2006 when erosion started, and even a slightly higher. So interestingly here, this oscillating after 2017 indicates a further improvement, because this high peak there, you can see, is already a significant improvement in comparison to the level of democraticness before. So Ecuador is one of these examples where democratic quality even can exceed, the previous level. And this is also the case in Moldova, much clearer here, you see here this significant improvement of democratic quality after the end of democratic erosion. So then we come to the case of stasis, and here United States is the case, and possibly you were surprised because maybe your impression was that democracy in the United States has improved during the term of Joseph Biden. So according LDI, this is not the case. So we have a stopping of democratic erosion in 2021 with taking power of the new government. But since then, actually, there is no significant improvement. So it's actually a stasis. So the values have not changed. And so United States is an example of a country that after stopping erosion transferred into a stasis, and then supposedly, again, this is my hunch, is now entering in a new phase of democratic erosion. And this renewed episode of democratic erosion also is very well visible here in North Macedonia, which is one of, again, several examples where you can see here that since 2019, the decline is steady and clear. So now I come to my third step, which is talking about the factors and determinants of democratic reconstruction. And here I will follow an actor-centered approach, but also will consider the role of institutions. Why actor-centered? There is a broad consensus in the literature that agency is the main factor for democratic erosion. It's critical for the purposeful institutional change we can see during democratic erosion. It's the incumbents who implement this purposeful change of democratic rules. And likewise, it's the actors and the newly elected democratic government who is responsible for the democratic reconstruction in the post-erosion episode. So, actors. We need to be clear about one important thing, namely that this new government has a kind of a double assignment. On the one hand, certainly it's about assuming power and conducting the normal government business. But on the other hand, The task at hand is undoing the authoritarian pathologies that have been established by the predecessor. So in this sense, the post-erosion government is confronted with a mission that goes beyond the normal cycle of changing a government. It also has this additional task of undoing authoritarian pathologies. And what does this mean? My suggestion is that we really have to break this down in several tasks and several steps that strictly speaking are not the same. So removing authoritarian elements, that means, you want to restore the independence of the judiciary and remove, for example, persons that have been, appointed by the erosion agents into agencies, into leading positions of important control bodies, and so on. But it's not only about removing these authoritarian elements, it's also about revitalizing the functioning of democratic procedures. So coming back to certain norms and also certain behavior that is important for democratic procedures and well-functioning of democratic procedures. It's also about informal practices that during democratic erosion have been installed and established by erosion agents and that have to be scaled back into a normal, so to say, democratic informality and behavior. And finally, it's also about installing guardrails to preempt another possible episode of or future attempts of democratic erosion. So in a nutshell, what I want to say is that it's a multidimensional endeavor. It's an endeavor that addresses actually multiple tasks that the new government has to fulfill. And this is additional to the normal, and this is the point, additional to the normal business of, of governing. So I theorize now in terms of this actorness and agency, two requirements for democratic reconstruction. And this is firstly, the normative commitment of the new government that needs to be existent. So this also sounds like very intuitive and very logical, but still this aspect of normative commitment of key actors is an aspect that interestingly in the literature has so far received little attention. And especially in the context of democratic erosion, where we have actors and leaders who manifest an anti-democratic behavior and attitude, this normative aspect gains relevance and maybe is a new and so far overlooked aspect that should be studied more in detail. I follow here Scott's argument, and we've been exchanging about this also, who argues that actors' preferences about the political regime are critically important. Scott developed this argument in a different context, namely in the survival of democracies in hard places, but I think that his findings are nonetheless significant for the processes of democratic backsliding also. Because what he emphasizes and what is important for the process of democratic erosion equally is that institutional constraints alone are not sufficient to maintain democracy, but it needs also this democratic commitment of the relevant actors. For analyzing this commitment, I propose to do two things, to look at the deeds as well as the words. So I think it's very important how the new actors, this new government frames its mission, frames its program of restoring democracy. So is there a public discourse of commitment for democratic reconstruction? How does the new government frame this? Is it more implicit, so low-key approach, Or is it very strong? Is it a strong messaging? Is it very outspoken? And is the government also already presenting some concrete program of democratic reconstruction? A first and tentative look demonstrates that this can be very different. So, for example, the government of Donald Tusk in Poland is an example for this very strong messaging and very outspoken way of addressing the domestic audience with the idea of condemning the previous government and holding it accountable. And then on the other hand side, how he wants to restore the rule of law and democracy. The same applies to Ecuador, where Lenín Moreno already in his first speech very clearly said how he would distance himself from and how he would restore democracy, what his style of governance would be, and so forth. So very clear, very concrete, framing of this program of democratic reconstruction. By contrast, when you look at the inaugural speeches of Joe Biden and Lula, for example, you find a completely different approach. It's an implicit approach, low-key approach, with only very vague and general references to democracy and no outline whatsoever about specific measures or programs of restoring democracy. So there is really a broad variance of how this new government's frame and also address their mission of democratic reconstruction towards the domestic audience. The other factor that influences the path and the outcome of post-erosion reconstruction significantly, of course, are widow factors. And I call them factors because it's not only actors. I mean, it's easy to understand that there are widow actors, which presumably are the erosion agents of the previous government and their followers who or do not support at all or only to a very small extent the democratic reconstruction, which means scaling back their own provisions and elements they entrench. But on the other hand side, we also, or the new government can also be confronted with institutional hurdles or dysfunctionalities that would that result, of course, from the democratic erosion, but that would also hinder the democratic reconstruction. So therefore, I call it widow factors because it's the actors plus possible institutions. So talking about these institutions, oops, no, this is not the wrong one. Sorry. So now, first of all, I will give you an overview how you might understand this, these factors and how they interact. So we have the new government's democratic commitment, which can be explicit or implicit, and then we have the openly open opposition or an opposition that is not open. I mean, this normal competition maybe. And we have an opposition that is self-restraining. So the former erosion agents would embrace their constitutional role as an opposition without opposing to the democratic reconstruction. And I also filled this matrix already with some examples. As I said, Brazil and the United States are examples for this implicit messaging of the democratic commitment. And of course, we have an open opposition. And in Poland, we have this explicit example with a strong opposition. And then we have Czech Republic and Ecuador in this quarter of the matrix. So speaking about the institutions, or the dysfunctionality of institutions being sticky, I just want to give some examples. We all know about the most notable example of the cardinal laws in Hungary, which are very difficult ever to replace or to erase. And we know that a lot of legal scholars already are working on thinking about what can be done if ever the Orban government will be replaced, I mean, hopefully, but what happens then with these cardinal laws? Because they are practically, unmovable. So here's a severe problem that will emerge in the future, definitely in Hungary. But we can also look at more current examples, and I shortly want to discuss Brazil and Poland, because they both offer interesting but different cases. Brazil is a case of this dysfunctionality where during the erosion process under Bolsonaro, and in the interest of defending democracy, actors and institutions developed specific patterns. And one example is the Supreme Court, which had executed a very strong role during the presidency of Bolsonaro. And we heard all Sergio Fausto here, who was here in September giving this wonderful lecture, and who was pointing to the fact that the role of the Supreme Court no longer fully corresponds to the spirit of the separation of powers, but moved, that is a literal citation, a little further off the borders, and then this stretching became the new normal. So this is what I mean with the dysfunctionality now in the post-Bolsonaro time, so to say, which is now the situation. I had a couple of interviews with legal experts in Brazil and poli-sci people, and they all confirmed the excessive protagonism of the judicial power in Brazil and the need for self-restraint. And the same applies to the legislative, and we have here people, Mayara and Jessica, who are working on this. So, I mean, this is really an interesting problem that is out there. In Poland, the situation is different. In Poland, the point is that the new government wants to restore the rule of law, and especially the independence of the National Justice Council and the Supreme Court. But so far, it proves absolutely impossible to do so. So we have a strong determination of the actors to restore the judicial independence, but it's not possible because of the institutional constellation and the partisan constellation in the executive. So the president Duda is close to PiS, and according to the semi-presidential system in Poland, the president has a very strong role, so he can veto any law that the parliament approves, any law. And to overcome this veto, 3/5, which is absolutely impossible for the acting government, because the government has not this broad majority. So it's absolutely impossible for the parliament. It knows already, ex ante the parliament, that it's not able to do anything. The second path that the president can choose is he takes a law from the parliament and transfers it to the Supreme Tribunal, but the Supreme Tribunal is a packed court. So it's all PiS people. Guess how the decision would be. So either way, the government is absolutely paralyzed. It's really caught as not being able to move forward. Now, this points to another problem, which I call the dilemma of democratizers, post-erosion democratizers, and that is, can authoritarian pathologies be undone by democratic means? Or would the new democratic government rather prefer to resort to the undemocratic means that are established and, possible because they have been established by the previous authoritarian government? So this is a very difficult situation what is now discussed in Poland. And of course, there would be ways that the democratic government would choose these undemocratic means. Couple of them, but is this the way it should be? So this is right now the discussion in Poland and between legal scholars and also the politicians, the policymakers, and you know, and also pundits and so on. So it's a real dilemma, and this dilemma can only be resolved if in the next presidential elections, which are in August next year, a new president will be elected. So a president that is not close to PiS, but to the government. But here comes the next. As the democratic government has not been able to fulfill any of these promises and expectations that have been presented to the people are frustrated and disaffected. So the popularity of the government has declined dramatically. And now the possibility, this is a bad precondition, of course, for the presidential elections. So the possibility is that a frustrated population would not vote for the pro-government presidential candidate. Anyways, I mean, there are two options. Or the pro-government candidate will be elected, then still the government would have lost 2 years. And it would only have 2 more years for this democratic reconstruction it wanted to implement. Or another PiS president will be elected, and then the whole project of democratic reconstruction will be impossible. So this is rather this is the rather gloomy perspective on these possible trajectories, you know, when you look at it concretely. And with this empirical spotlight, actually, I will directly come to my conclusion, because I think it illustrates quite well my argument, namely that the end of democratic erosion alone, and even the determination of new democratic governments alone, may be not sufficient to ensure this complete restoration of democracy and of a damaged democratic system as we would wish to have it. Nevertheless, and as we are after Thanksgiving and before Christmas, I don't want to end with a purely gloomy takeaway. So besides the bad news, like in Poland or United States, there are also good news. I mean, remember Czechia or Ecuador. So democratic reconstruction also can result in an improvement. I mean, we learned it. So it can constitute a chance even for improving democratic processes by introducing innovative elements, new elements, for example, and also guardrails. It can be a chance of strengthening democratic trust or trust into democracy, strengthening democratic attitudes and norms. But either way, democratic reconstruction after erosion most likely is complex, demanding, cumbersome, and highly vulnerable. What is quite clear is that the clearer the democratic commitment of the new government, the better for democratic reconstruction, and the less veto actors with obstructive behavior and actions, and the less institutional hurdles or dysfunctionalities, the less difficult and vulnerable the process will be. So one important lesson maybe for policymakers around the world is that they should not wait and hope for the desirable election in countries with democratic erosion, and then be relieved, like in the case of Brazil, or shocked, like in the case of Turkey, Hungary, or United States now. Policymakers should beware of thinking that change of government is already the back to normal. This is most likely not. I hope I convinced you of that. it's not simply that the change of government is back to normal. And understanding this openness, the vulnerability and the complexity of the post-erosion episode is useful and meaningful for the question how the return to democracy also can support it and protect it from outside. So, and here comes the next positive message. We know that authoritarian leaders learn from each other, and we know that authoritarian leaders have their playbooks for supporting democracy from within. So let's do the same. By the same token, strategic choices and performance of actors who are engaged in reversing erosion and institutional scope, conditions, and contexts provide lessons. So I think what we need is a playbook of post-erosion democratic reconstruction. So we should simply mirror what authoritarian leaders do and provide these playbooks. And who should do this? Well, the political scientists, of course, because it's our job to consider and our job to offer playbooks, and it's our job to offer analysis for these playbooks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marianne. We will have the opportunity to ask questions now. I will want to remind people online that they can submit questions. They have a box below their viewing screen, so they can submit questions if they want. I will let you handle the questions.
Laura.
Thank you, Marianne. This is incredibly ambitious. I also think it's incredibly relevant and important to think how to reconstruct sort of democracy after an episode of erosion. I had a couple of questions. One is conceptual, right? So I wasn't sure, how does this fit in the broader literature on transitions back to democracy, or what economists would call recalibration, right? So you talk about this reconstruction, right? But then you use cases that in my mind are different, right? So when you talk about Hungary or when you talk about Turkey, I would argue that whenever Orban or Erdogan step out of power or whatever, what we will be talking about there is a transition back to democracy. And that entails all sorts of, that can be thought of as a critical juncture in ways that a reconstruction like in Poland, maybe Brazil, maybe Colombia cannot be thought of, because there's not like that rough, right? Like, so I was wondering about that. On the other end, I was also wondering about how these compares to sort of Juan Linz's recalibration, right? And sort of these processes of in which the regime stumbles, but it doesn't quite break, right? So I had like that conceptual question. And then I had another question, a little bit about the ways in which the democratic erosion process may matter. And I think you kind of mentioned them, but you didn't go into detail, so you might already have thought about this. One is, I think, a key part of this is how advanced the process of erosion is, right? Like, of course, I mean, clearly, sort of in Poland, PIL managed to co-opt the courts in ways that Bolsonaro did not manage in Brazil, right? Like, so I think that these are key differences. But then I was also thinking about the modes in which you stop the erosion of democracy. And so I was thinking about the case of Ecuador vis-a-vis the case of Bolsonaro, for example, right? So in Ecuador, what you have is an incumbent that rises to power with the party of the autocrat, but then splits off. And so you have a real problem on how is this guy going to stay in office and manage to get enough support to push these anti-democratic reforms, right? Whereas Lula came to power with independent support. So he can actually rally around these things a little bit easier. So I was thinking if maybe sort of there's some kind of path dependency that is a little bit stronger, that in sort of the ways the erosion gets. Thanks again.
Yeah, actually, this already then gives me the opportunity to come to my backup slides. Of course, I thought about the correlation between the duration of democratic erosion and how it influences the success of democratic reconstruction. So there's a very simple the very simple assumption that the longer democratic erosion, the more complicated democratic reconstruction. For example, you could do this hypothesis. Seems intuitive. Interestingly, we have quite of counterexamples for that. So, for example, we have countries where democratic erosion was longer than in the United States, for example, but where the improvement was easier and swifter. So interestingly, I mean, I have to get more deeper into that and more profoundly analyze this. But I mean, this very intuitive correlation on the second perspective does not hold. So apparently, it's not only the duration of the process, but it's more the quality of the damage that has been done and the quality of the subversion during the process. Oh, sorry, during the process of democratic erosion. So yes, this is of course important, and this is something we have to look at. So the point of Hungary and Turkey, interestingly, I explicitly did not speak about Hungary and Turkey, you know, only when it came to my conclusions, I did not include it into my analysis, and that has a good reason. I actually I did for my measurement, I had to operationalize, of course, what is democratic erosion and what are countries that I would count, subsume under democratic erosion. So according to my measurement, and well, that's what everybody does. In the moment you cross the threshold between democracy and autocracy, you would say, this is a collapse. So we have a democratic breakdown and this is not a democracy anymore. So problem, if we don't have a democracy anymore, we don't have democratic erosion, because, you know, this would then be a deepening of autocracy, a consolidation of autocracy, but not the same thing. And I would follow that. The only thing is that for my measurement, I would give the country the chance of a 4-year period, and I would observe this country. And if after crossing the threshold towards autocracy, I would still observe it for one term, so to say, for 4 years. And if it then continues to decline, like in the case of Hungary, like in the case of Turkey, like in the case of Venezuela, then I would say, okay, this is not erosion anymore, this is autocratization. And I think this is theoretically sound, and this is what most of the people do, you know. So we should not conflate actually democratic erosion, which means we have an electoral democracy or a liberal democracy and a decline of democratic quality, and the passing of the threshold, and then a further deepening of an autocratization and a consolidation of an autocracy, like we see in Nicaragua is also an example. So I think you were the next.
Yeah, I think that you already clarify one of my questions, and the second question has to do more with the theoretical framework. So you focused your talk on the actors, but I was wondering to what extent this focus on actors can lead us to a misleading understanding of the structural causes of democratic backsliding of erosion. Because for me, at least in the case of Ecuador that you were showing in your graph, you have the president to like concentrate the power, and then as we can, if you can put the graph again, you can put the graph again.
Yeah.
So it seems that now they are like, yeah, they are in a process of full restoration. But for me, Daniel Noboa is again going backwards into a wave of authoritarianism. But he's a different phase from a different party with a different ideology.
Mm-hmm.
So we may think that the first president, I forgot the name right now, Correa. Once that you put away Correa from government, we may be able to fix the issue, right? But now you have a different person completely opposed to the previous one, who is following the same tactics and the same pattern. And I might think that your graph in a few years will show again that they are going backwards again in this trend. So I don't know to what extent this focus on actors can deviate the discussion about why people are still supporting these characters, regardless with their ideology or their background or their political parties. Because for me, it's the same case in Mexico. Like López Obrador is no longer in power, but you have Claudia Sheinbaum, the same political party, with the same popular support, the same in Bolivia. Once that Evo Morales was out of power, people voted again for the mass, and the same political party remained. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on how can we see this discussion in the future, not only considering the role of the actors and their willingness to support democratic institutions, but also the popular perceptions of the people about democracy?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complex, it's a good question, but it's a big complexity you are asking for. So I'm afraid that I have no final answers to that. I only can try to, I only can try to break down your question a little bit in different fields that I think, because we are here confronted with a new puzzle. So what we're doing here, and this is also what I'm doing, I'm laying out the threads, for the future academic work we have to do. And what I hear from your question is that there's, on the one hand side, there's this actor, this feel of actorness and agency and actors. And by the way, if you say Novoa now is, possibly also bringing the country back to the episode of erosion and using the same, instruments and tools like Correa and so on, this would be just what I said when you remember maybe when I said the erosion agents for the renewed episode of erosion can be the same ones like Trump, but it also can different ones from different parties, So both things are possible. And we have to analyze this, and you're absolutely right. What is it? Is it learning so that the new erosion agents learn from the predecessor, so to say? And what is it behind that? What mechanisms are behind that? This is the one research field I see. But the other one is what you also talked about is the citizens. So what do we know about the citizens' preferences to vote for new erosion agents? I mean, you can boil it down. Why did the American people vote Trump? I mean, this is exactly the question, we're before. So I think there will be a lot of people who will analyze this. Of course, it's a very important aspect of the whole erosion process. I mean, why has Orban been elected 4 times? He has been reconfirmed, and every time with a bigger majority, although everybody knows what he's doing. And again, PIS has been also re-elected, if you want so, in last autumn. It was a victory for PIS. So the fact that there was formed a coalition that now is in government does not mean that PIS is, away from the scenery. It's there, So I think what we are having to face is that we need to consider these new power games and actor constellations in the post-erosion episode. And therefore I have this actor-centered approach,
Marianne, we have about 15 minutes.
Okay. So then
I'll be very, very quick. But first of all, thank you for your presentation. This is fascinating. And I really like the idea of thinking about erosion and post-erosion as episodes and as distinctive episodes. I think that's an important contribution. My first question has to do, similar to Laura's question about how erosion ends and how that actually might matter for the next episode. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about protest. That seems to be the odd category out of the ones that you identified. Voting, coalition enables, inter-party change, but protest is somewhat
different. The actors are generally really different when people take to the streets. So I wanted to hear a little bit about the mechanisms behind that. And the second, could you say more about the normative commitment? Since this is an actor and an agents-based approach, I wanted to hear more about I agree with you that normative commitment matters. I'm just challenged on how do we know it? How are we going to measure it? How do we know they have a normative commitment? Because often what people say is very different than what they do.
Thank you so much for the question. And I now see that I forgot your question about the, and this is very important. I really, I considered also this question. How? Because Laura, she asked, how does erosion influence the post-erosion episode? But I would actually, and this is the answer to your question and also to Laura's, I would also argue that the end of democratic erosion might be a factor that influences the path of the post-erosion episode. And this goes back also to what we knew on, the knowledge of democratization theory. I mean, we know that the end of an autocracy, be it external invasion, be it domestic, domestically triggered, be it an elite settlement or be it a revolution. I mean, we have all these examples out there, Portugal, Spain, and so on, that we know from democratization theory that the end of autocracy does matter for the way how then the actors would steer the democratization process. And I think this is transferable, and I would do this. So my hypothesis is, my expectation, my assumption is that, for example, the end of democratic erosion by electoral vote might trigger more polarization, because you have this power game between the predecessor who doesn't want to be scaled back his authoritarian elements, and then you have the new government. So you have automatically this very difficult wrestling in a lot of cases. While, for example, in the case of Ecuador, you could see that an actor like Lenin Moreno, who immediately took a very inclusive, very consensual, very an approach of dialogue, an approach of including all the other actors, civil society, and so on. This was kind of a different approach and reduced at that moment. I'm not talking about now, but at that moment it reduced polarization. So actually, and this is the answer to your question. Yes, I think that also the way how democratic erosion stops will influence and will matter for them the path of the democratic recovery. Protest, this includes protest. So I think protest is also a good example, but because in Bulgaria, for example, you saw the governments and also the opposition saw, okay, people are protesting here now for a longer time. And this influences, of course, this influences the attitude of the government and of the erosion agents, but also of the opposition. So it matters. Normative commitment, this is an interesting question. I actually developed a kind of framework for measuring this normative commitment on the basis of Scott's ideas. He had exposed already in Democracy in Hard Places. So I can show you. The first ideas for that. I didn't want to present it because it's kind of complex. I would measure this with two criteria. The first criterion would be adherence to democratic rules and principles. So I have a 4-point scale for that, to measure this adherence to rules and principles. And then the second criterion would be the willingness to forego instrumental benefits in order to preserve democracy. And also here, I would also have a 5-point and continuum of five-point continuum, which would reflect this willingness. So we go from strong democratic commitment in both criteria, for example, to a non-existent, which would then reflect a fully authoritarian or even totalitarian actor. So I know that this is now very fast and very maybe reduced, but just to say that, yes, I'm thinking of conceptualizing this better and in order to measure it also. Scott and, okay, I take now the questions together maybe. It was you and, no, Sandra and Scott and Rashid.
Well, thank you. I thought this was very, very interesting and excellent. I might try 3 quick comments. So one is, it's just a question about how you measure the end of erosion. I mean, part of what you said made me think that as soon as a regime becomes an electoral autocracy, you are operationally stating that is the end of erosion. Because it's already, you know, at that point it starts to become deepening of autocratization rather than democratic erosion. So that's just a quick question of clarification. Second, I mean, it occurs to me that I think the tasks for democratic reconstruction are, this follows on maybe Laura's comment, I think they're very different depending not on the length of the episode of erosion, but the end point of autocratization. So, I mean, the challenge for reconstructing democracy is really different in a place like Venezuela, where you've had massive state destruction, humanitarian catastrophe, and, you know, a profound deepening of authoritarianism. We could add other cases, Russia, Nicaragua, than it is in a place like the US or Brazil or the Czech Republic. So that, to me, you know, in terms of what are the challenges for reconstruction, I think intuitively that would be the most critical variable for how different those tasks are. And then the third is just, I mean, building on your call for a democratic playbook, I don't think any place, any country in the world has ever created a ministry of democratic deepening. But they should. I mean, they're democratic regimes, especially in a process of, you know, democratic reconstruction or after any transition to democracy, democratic regimes should have very deliberate strategies for how do you build democracy? How do you weaken authoritarian actors? There are places in the world that intuitively did something pretty close to that. I think Argentina after 1983, Brazil under Fernando Henrique Cardoso, you know, but it's never existed. And it should exist as you correct the state. So yeah. Kudos for your call for doing that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. Let me start with the last comment. I absolutely agree also here with you. And just saying that my state, where my university is based, Saxony, and you might know that Saxony is a state in Germany where we have a high level of right-wing, right-wing support, almost 40%. And actually in this country, we have a ministry that is called Ministry for Justice, Europe, Gender Equality and Democracy. Imagine that. Mm-hmm. So it's a nice mixture, no? But again, yeah, I mean, yes, exactly. Yes, we need this, would need this. So coming back to the question of democratic reconstruction. Yeah, I mean, again, I would make a distinction between democratic erosion, which means that we have a liberal or an electoral democracy and it erodes. Passing the threshold of autocracy, then again, I would give this country kind of an certain time period where I would observe if it's continuing, it's deepening of autocratization or not. But then in a case like Venezuela or Nicaragua, I would definitely not, since 2000, I think WIDM measures until 2004, I think. I mean, correct me, Michael, but I think Venezuela starts to be an autocracy according to WIDM in 2004. So anyways, I mean, at some point of time, which is really long ago, Venezuela crossed the threshold to an autocracy. So I would not speak of democratic erosion here anymore for a long time. I mean, Venezuela is a country which headed after a period of democratic erosion for certain, when it crossed the threshold to autocracy, and when all the really purely authoritarian elements like open repression, or what you enlisted, human rights violations and so on. For me, this is quite clear that we have here an authoritarian regime that is deepening its autocraticness. So if this process would come to an end at whatever point of time, then we would be confronted with the same puzzle which we have in a lot of cases, and that is re-democratization after a long, enduring autocracy. Full stop. I mean, this is then a different puzzle. This is not my puzzle. I mean, this is a valid and an important, but it's a different puzzle. It's not the puzzle of reconstructing after a democratic erosion. And why is this so? Why do I think that we have to distinguish this? Exactly because of what you said, it's a different kind of logic, it's different determinants, it's a different level of autocraticness, and it's a different level of a lot of things like repression and so on. So we have to deal with it on the basis of a different concept. And the concept then would be democratization after an enduring autocratic, a phase of enduring autocracy. So I have Rashid and I also have Sandra.
Sure. My question, I had a couple of comments. The first one is similar to Scott's point. I'm wondering even if the countries do not cross to the same threshold, I think the ending point might matter for how easy it might be to reconstruct. Think of a country that goes from, say, absolute democracy from a drop from 1 to say 0.8, right, before having to go back up, and compare that to a country that drops from, say, 0.8 to 0.6. And we might think of them both as having two levels dropping, but I don't think that they're starting at the same point. And so I think reconstruction might still be different for these countries, or how easy or difficult it would be. And I also wonder if the elements that were eroded during the erosion phase matter, right? Because it might be, the target of erosion might be specific institutions, it might be human rights, it might be different stuff. And I wonder if you think the type of erosion, what happens within the erosion phase. I know you don't touch on that, but do you think that that might also affect the outcome? Because from the way I understand it, it seems like you're treating the post-erosion phase as almost an isolatory period that is
not isolated. I said this at the beginning, that I think that they're really interlinked.
right.
Yeah. And to answer your question, yes, I think that the way the question which elements and in what way they have been eroded do matter. And I also think that the level of democraticness when the onset at the onset of the erosion does matter, of course. We should consider this, yeah.
I'm thinking at the onset of the post-erosion.
No, of the erosion. I mean, you said that the level of democraticness at the onset of erosion would matter for the post-erosion episode.
At the onset of post-erosion phase, even if they load at a similar levels, but because they started at different levels, they drop. But then when they have starting, it would look different. I mean, we can talk about it later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Sandra.
For the presentation, Marianne, I think this is really important work. I would like, if you have time, to hear you talk a little bit more about the concept of institutional dysfunction. The two examples that you used are examples about the judiciary, right? And when in your brief, recalling of the events in Brazil and Poland, right? It was Poland, I remember, Brazil and Poland. I was thinking that these stories could also be told in a simpler version of things through a veto understanding of the judiciary as either as a veto actor or as problems of the normative commitments of the actors within the judiciary.
Yeah.
So in other words, there's a world in which the theory is even simpler, and why do you need to have a separate category for institutional dysfunction, and what do you mean by institutional dysfunction, and what other elements? I wanted to hear you talk more about it.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. Actually, yeah, you know, when I started with my conceptualization, I started with my actor-centered approach because I'm a person that I'm traditionally following a agency approach. But then I saw these two theoretically possible and also empirical observable cases that on the one hand side, you have simply hurdles, not dysfunctions. It's two things. You have institutional hurdles or institutional, I would say constellations or context, co-conditions that do not favor in certain situations the democratic reconstruction. So this is the example of Poland. And it's not only about the judiciary, you know, it's about the really about the institutional architecture of the system. It's because of the, you know, the strong role of the president, and then of course the constellation of bipartisanship, so that the president is not of the same party as the prime minister. So this is the one case, and therefore I did the two, you know, because Poland stands for or embodies this example for an institutional hurdle that can simply completely neutrally, I mean, because the institutions are like they are and the rules are like they are, even in the, you know, even in the post-democratic erosion, post-erosion, excuse me, episode. The dysfunction is a different thing. The dysfunction I label what happens in Brazil, where, you know, the defense of democracy made during the erosion episode made that certain institutions like the Supreme Court, but also the Parliament, you know, acted in a way, again, defending democracy against Bolsonaro. But then after the end of democratic erosion, did not self-restrain themselves and came back to the role they had beforehand. This is what people, you know, what people told me, that this, you know, scaling back from this very excessive protagonism that the that actors or institutions had, not only the Supreme Court, also legislative, that this lacking self-restraint now poses a dysfunctionality for the Brazilian political system. So there are two different cases, but they both are linked to institutional settings in an interplay with actors. This has to be considered, but it's still institutions that play a role here.
We may have time for one more question.
So I come from a civics background, high school civics teacher, and mostly American history, but it seems to me that democracy being talked about is reduced to government and institutions and kind of almost completely forgetting citizenship. And that the role of the citizen is reduced to just a voter, just a protester, just a public opinion, rather than thinking of the underpinning of democracy being limited government, government guided by people, government for like so freedom and responsibility and the social contract between government and people. That it almost seems like democracy is now becoming a policy rather than a framework for government to work in. And I get where actors almost have made it that way. But it seems to me that you talk about stalemate and that a divided government almost couldn't, we talk about that as being unfunctional rather than being, that is the function of what a divided government does, is to limit what policies could be made or to this, like what, again, just talking about the US government, but to be like the role of the Senate was to limit how many bills can go through Congress, and that government wasn't supposed to have like this size. And so to say, is there a space for like democratic erosion? I guess, what is civic responsibility in buildup and not just as agents of voting for these changes, but like if you're talking about, I don't know what the elements of erosion are, but the decline in social fabric, how we treat one another, how people feel in the country, but also, is there rules for democratic policy to cover the wide breadth of, we want limited government, we want a more forceful federal government, that it's not a one side is now becoming the party of democracy and the other's not. That I feel like it's now becoming where democracy is getting shrunk to a ping pong ball rather than being the encompassing pool that everybody was participating under.
Well, I mean, this is a big question. I'm not sure if I can.
Well, I guess
It was a question. I'm not sure if I can answer.
yeah. I guess my to kind of go for it is like, as more and more people are studying democracy and the decline of democracy, is there, does it feel like to you, I guess, the studying it, does it feel like democracy is shrinking into being like, this is the needle of what democracy is, and everybody better kind of fit into it rather than being, it was supposed to be a framework rather than a thing? Like it kind of seems like that democracy is becoming the thing rather than effective governing, I guess, or social governing.
I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but I think, I mean, you started with citizens, and I think, of course, citizens are still and should be citizens, should be still an important part of democracy. I mean, democracy means rule by the people. And if I understood you correctly, you're criticizing that it is not the case anymore. And I would, in some cases, agree. But I think the most important point, and this is why I'm working on that, is that we have to protect whatever we understand under democracy. You know, democracies are different in different countries. But whatever it is, we should protect it. I mean, this is my message, more or less, you know. And because and here's my normative commitment, because every other form of a societal order is worse. But this also is a call for not only for protecting, but also for making it better. You know, and the good thing is that democracy is actually a political order that is flexible and a learning order. So no other political order has shown in the history that it could be so open for learning and for innovations. So we should take this as a call. Sorry, this is a very general answer, but I have Michael there.
I think that we are out of time.
Okay,
But I know many, sorry, apologies, Michael. I know that many people have questions.
so this was my last word.
Yes,
We should protect and innovate democracy.
thank you so much.
I think everything I hear.